Anyway, Beckett. I don't know where to begin because probably more words have been written about Beckett as a writer than anybody other than Shakespeare, because Beckett did something remarkable and unique. Now, I've always said, when I do talks about theatre, I've always said there are three great moments in the evolution of theatre. I mean, it is a constant evolution. It is a perfect example of how evolution works, that ideas mutate, ideas change, things shift. There is always motion. It's always moving forward. But what fascinates me is that these three, to my mind, and as I say, everything I tell you may be wrong, but this is purely my opinion. There are three great moments of theatre. And the first was when the Greeks realized that what they were presenting as a religious spectacle could actually become a form of entertainment. And that the drama that they developed, which from their mind, they were poets, and they developed a form of drama that began by recitation and ended up as performance. But they invented the concept of theatre, the first great moment in the evolution of theatre. And it drifted along pretty much consistently until for about 2,000 years. And then along came a group of writers, the principal of whom was William Shakespeare, who changed the ground rules and stopped working on the principle of God is in his heaven, the king is on his throne, and all's right with the world, and presented the notion that everybody was human. And it didn't matter whether you sat with your behind on a purple cushion or on a wooden stool, you were still a human being. So Shakespeare and many of his colleagues wrote plays about humanity in a much more focused way. And so that was the second great shift in the development of theatre as we know it. And that drifted along through various forms. And we've talked about, from 70 years after Shakespeare's death and the arrival of Farquhar, and all through Restoration and the Comedy of Manners period, and on into Oscar Wilde, whose line of development would head down the path of comic satirists such as Noel Coward and Terence Rattigan and people like that. We also have the advent of George Bernard Shaw and the political movement of theatre, which was followed up by the Angry Young Men. But I'll come back to them in a moment because there was another influence on them. But then something very special happened, and it happened 3 years after the death of George Bernard Shaw, that timeline we've been talking about all the way through. 3 years after his death, 1953, there came to the stage a play that changed writing for and the acting of theatre so profoundly that we can trace much of modern playwriting to that moment. It was the third great shift, and it was Samuel Beckett. Beckett revolutionized theatre by doing the thing that so often we do in our lives, and so often we do in our creative lives. When all else fails, go back to the beginning, go back to basics. And to my mind, that's exactly what Beckett did. And I'll explain why I think that. The play, of course, was Waiting for Godot. Not, I'm terribly sorry to my dear fellow Americans, not Waiting for Godot. Beckett was quite absolute. The word is pronounced Godot, and it's not God. Which reminds me, there was a wonderful little book somebody once gave me, which was Modern Literature as Haiku. And the haiku for Waiting for Godot is, and I quote, Act 1, it's hopeless. My boots don't fit. Where is God? Act 2, the same thing. Now, in a funny way, that's probably quite accurate, but Godot isn't God. I'll come to that in a moment. Let's go back to the beginning. Let's start with Sam Beckett himself. He was born in Dublin. He was an Irishman. He was born on Friday the 13th in 1906. And if you want to check it out, Friday the 13th in 1906 was also Good Friday, which I think you would have found, and probably did find, quite amusing. He was born 6 years after the death of Oscar Wilde. Again, our timeline. Everything is much closer than you think. And there's not great gouts. There's great gouts of time between the actual writing, but between the birth and the influences on a person and the one that preceded is never that long. So he was born into the end of Victorian, the beginning of the Edwardian period, and in Dublin, which was still at that stage second city of the British Empire. He went, therefore, Ireland was still one country at that time, long before the border was put there. He went to Portora Royal School in Enniskillen, which is in County Fermanagh, now in the north, and that was the same school that Oscar Wilde went to. He got a BA degree from Trinity College, which is where Oscar Wilde got his initial college education, and also following in the tradition of Farquhar and Sheridan. So Trinity had an influence on all of these writers as well. Beckett also returned to Trinity to teach, just for a short space, 1930, 1931. I think they eventually asked him to leave. He was often being asked to leave because of his opinions. Now, very important point. How can I put this? He had the most inquiring mind, and that mind, to a degree, was influenced deeply by his experience. Everybody's mind is. I know that sounds like a fatuous thing to say, but I think there was a thing that was once said about Harold Pinter. In fact, I might have said it, but anyway, most creative artists, if you imagine that their imagination is an attic in the house of their brain, and most good artists have like a stair or a ladder that they can get up there. Well, Pinter, and I think Beckett as well, had a moving staircase. The ease with which he could move into his imagination was quite phenomenal. Anyway, Beckett traveled around Europe, eventually settled in Paris, and moved into Paris in the 1930s, mid-1930s. 1939, the war broke out. France was invaded by Germany, but Beckett stayed there because I think he basically felt that war in France was far better and more interesting than peace in Ireland. So he stayed there throughout the war. He became he joined the Maquis. He received medals from the French government for his work during the occupation. After the war broke out, after the war broke out, yes, he actually got into a tussle with a pimp, and was very nearly killed. He was stabbed in the chest. He actually became a friend of the attacker later on, because I think he found the guy really quite interesting. Around this time, he met Suzanne, his lifelong partner, eventually his wife. They were married together for over 50 years. She was a huge influence on him. But also in this period, he'd become a good friend and confidant of James Joyce. And he was fascinated by Joyce, the writer, by Joyce's level of imagination, by the complexity of Joyce's language, by the majesty with which Joyce could use language. But through the war period, he began to consider that he as a writer was far too much enthralled to Joyce. He always believed that for as long as he stayed in the Joyce mode, that he would never achieve anything for himself. He would merely be a pale imitation. He said it himself, and I'm going to read the quote. If I can find it. I realized that Joyce had gone as far as one could in the direction of knowing more. of being in control of one's material. Joyce was phenomenally well read. He was always adding to it. You only have to look at his proofs to see that. I realized that my own way was in impoverishment, in lack of knowledge, and in taking away, in subtracting rather than adding. In other words, his approach to language, unlike Joyce, and if you've ever read Ulysses or tried to read Finnegan's Wake, you'll understand what I mean. Beckett moved to a minimalist approach rather than the maximization of the use of language that Joyce could do so brilliantly. And Finnegan's Wake is the perfect example of that. Now, playwrights don't just happen. It is very, very rare that somebody writes a play of genius first time. Playwrights evolve. What they write generally evolves from their own experience, from their observation of the experience of others, from their awareness of life as it is around them. I've always taught actors this simple principle that you are the sum total of your own experience. What you are and who you are, and even why you are, is the result of all the things and all the people that have happened to you, the stuff that you've experienced in life. That's what makes you who you are. Yes, there's a certain amount of inherited, from your chromosomes, you are certain things. You look in a certain way and you might behave in a certain way. You inherit in certain aspects of things, but the majority of your life is not inherited, it is experienced. And as you grow and as you experience, you begin to perceive things in a more complex way. Beckett fought against it, I believe. Beckett tried to look for the simpler way, for the purer, for the simplicity. Simple is the word I'll keep using. The simplicity of life and of the human condition. He started he was a novelist and a poet long before he was a playwright. It was 1932 he wrote his first novel, which was called Dream of Fair to Middling Women. It was rejected over and over and over again. In fact, it only got published eventually in 1992. But in spite of that, that he couldn't get it published, it actually it was sort of the source material for a lot of his poetry. It was a book rich with ideas, and so the next book that he wrote was More Pricks Than Kicks. Each of these pieces of writing, each of these novels, followed on. They evolved out of that dream of Fair to Middling Women. His writing was a constant exercise, a constant evolution in that notion of striving for the simplicity, striving for the purity. And if you want an example of where the end of that process led him, or one of the ends, you have to look at the play Not I, which is simply, it's a play of a short, relatively short play. And the only thing you see on stage is a woman's mouth. You see nothing else, just her mouth talking. In other words, what she says is the essence of the play. Nothing else about her. Nothing about her face, her body, anything that can give you a context other than the words she speaks. And it's one of the most difficult things to do for any actor, because it's also very difficult for a director and a lighting designer, because that's all you can see, the mouth. In fact, those of us on the inside often describe that play simply as the mouth. Anyway, all this early writing was the foundation for the later works, but it took him quite some time to discover the particular form that changed the world of theatre. And when he did start, and I'm going to talk about two plays in particular, he wrote, because he'd lived there for so long, he wrote mostly in French. The two most, for instance, Waiting for Godot, as we understand it, was actually written en attendant Godot. It was written as in French. He didn't have it translated or translated himself. He sat down and wrote it again in English. And if you have a comparison, I did have a book with the two texts side by side, and I think somebody's stolen it because people are always taking books. But he wrote in French because it was the language he felt that was, I think he felt it was more economic in many ways. And the other play that he did the same thing was Fin de Partir, Endgame. Again, written in French, translated, or rather rewritten in English. Now, when Waiting for Godot materialized, it didn't happen instantly as a success. It did in France, strangely enough. It was there was a critic, a famous critic, Vivian Mercier, who wrote this wonderful review, which is often misquoted, but I'm going to read the actual thing. Beckett has achieved a theoretical impossibility, a play in which nothing happens, yet keeps audiences glued to their seats. And what's more, since the second act is a subtly different reprise of the first, he has written a play in which nothing happens twice. Now, it's a very famous review, but it's also completely wrong in that, for those of us who believe this, but to my mind, Waiting for Godot is not a play in which nothing happens twice, but a play in which absolutely everything happens, or everything that can happen in the human condition, and forgive me, from a male perspective, is in this play. This is a play in which everything happens. When it was first done in Paris, it was a huge success. Not quite so in London. It opened, I think, in the Arts Theatre in 1955, got a lot of very negative reviews. Nobody knew what it was about. Nobody had seen anything like this. Nobody had ever seen a play like this. A play in which the opening stage direction says, a road, a tree, a rock, a country road, a tree, a rock, two men. And then it begins. The absolute purity of it, the absolute simplicity of it. And just when you think you've got some control over it with the two men, two more men appear, one of them on the end of a rope. Nothing like this had ever been seen, at least certainly not within conventional theatre for a very, very long time. So they didn't know what to make of it. But there were two critics, English critics, who did get it. Harold Hobson, very famous critic with the Sunday Times, and Kenneth Tynan, who eventually became, I think he was literary editor or literary manager for the National Theatre in the UK. Very, very powerful critics. They liked it. Slowly it began to get recognition. I think its first staging in America was in Miami, where, believe it or not, it was advertised as the comedy triumph of two continents. But it slowly began to gain popularity, possibly through its notoriety as well. After the US, then it was on in Germany, it was on in various countries, various translations, translated into Polish, translated into Russian, and it's now, believe it or not, one of the world's most produced plays from the 20th century on any given evening. Somewhere in the world, maybe not right now because of the problems we're having, but generally speaking, on any given evening, anywhere in the world, somewhere in the world, there are still two guys waiting for Godot. We played it I remember in Beijing, and we weren't sure. We looked at the theatre and we came out, and my colleague Barry McGovern, who was playing Vladimir, we were walking down the street in Beijing and saying, I wonder if they'll understand it. I wonder if they'll get it. And I saw two guys sitting on a bench at a crossroads doing nothing. And I said, Barry, they'll get it. They'll understand it. It is universal because it is about the human condition. One tiny point, and this is purely personal, Beckett always refused to allow the play to be filmed. He did allow it to be done on television, and there were one or two TV presentations of it. Burgess Meredith did it with he played Vladimir at one point. E.G. Marshall did it with Bert Lahr, I think. Zero Mostel was with the other one, but he never allowed it to be filmed. Fortunately, it was eventually, and I'm really grateful for that because I'm in the film, and we'll have more about that later as well. So much, as I say, has been written and said about Waiting for Godot. Who is he? Why does he never come? Why do the two men continue to wait? Who are Pozzo and Lucky? Why are the two men called Vladimir and Estragon but never refer to each other as that, but call one another Gogo and Didi? Actually, Didi does refer to himself as Vladimir and to his friend as Estragon at one point in the play, but they never call each other that. Where do they come from? Where do they go? Where does Pozzo come from? Where does he go? How does Pozzo become blind? Why does Lucky serve him? All the questions that actually don't matter. Because the play has to be approached, to my mind, on the level of what is. I'll come to that again in a minute, but if you start to over-question it, who is Godot? You are moving away from the fundamental premise upon which it is written. I mentioned there were two plays I was going to talk about, Waiting for Godot and Endgame. I remember now, Waiting for Godot, I just have to mention the fact that my particular association with it, so an awful lot of it comes from my own experience. The Gate Theatre in Dublin in 1988 celebrated its 60th anniversary with a production of Waiting for Godot. We were cast. Beckett was meant to come and direct it. The great sorrow for us that he got too ill. The great joy was that he sent his assistant, Walter Asmus, who's one of the leading Beckett authorities in the world. He directed it. It was a great success, and we continued to do the play on and off around the world for 20 years. We did festivals in Dublin, in the Barbican in London, we did the Lincoln Center, we did Melbourne, we took it to Beijing, to Shanghai, we toured America 3 times, actually appeared in Pittsburgh in 2006, which is why I'm sitting here now. So a long experience of this particular play with the same group of actors, 4 of us growing old together over a 20-year period with the same director, purifying and purifying and purifying. Very extraordinary experience. So we often got asked, well, what is it about? Why ask all that list of questions? Why, who, what? And you have to come down to a very simple point. What's the play called? The play is called Waiting for Godot. So what is the play about? And you might say it's about waiting for Godot. That begs the question, who or what is Godot? Which is too complex. You make it simpler. The play is about waiting. Beckett was asked at one point, what's the play about? And he said, it's all in Lucky's speech. Now, those of you who've seen it or know it, know that Lucky, the servant character or the slave character, has this enormous speech. I always used to say to Stephen Brennan, who played the role with me, we all had to learn a lot of lines. He only had to learn 2. Granted, one of his lines was a page and a half long, but it was anyway, in that speech, everything is defined. The purpose of waiting is defined. And if you sum up Lucky's speech in this context, what he simply says is, given the existence of a personal God, not of God, of a personal God with a white beard, because that's the way we normally, if we think of a personal God, visualize a personal God. Given the fact that we are alive, given the fact that we lead our lives and that we take exercise and that we fulfill our purposes and do all of the things that life offers to us, granted that we do all of that and have our belief in a personal God, like it or not, we all end up in an abode of stones. And what is an abode of stones? A graveyard. So, what is it? We are born, Pozzo says it. They give birth astride of a grave. The light gleams an instant, then it's night once more. From eternity of nothing, a brief moment of life, to an eternity of nothing. Life is that brief moment, that one moment, when everything that can happen to you does happen to you, and then it's over. So what do you do from the moment you're born? You're waiting. And what are you waiting for? An abode of stones. From the moment we are born, we are waiting for death. And we spend our lives waiting. When you are born, you wait to have your nappy changed, or you wait for a breast that you can suckle on. When you reach a certain age, you're waiting to go to school. Once you start going to school, you're waiting for it to end. Once you finish that, you're waiting for a job, and you get a job, you're waiting to retire. We spend our lives waiting for the next moment. We spend our lives in anticipation that when that comes, all will be better. We are always hoping that that object, that thing that we wait for, will improve our lives, will make us happier. Gogo and Didi waiting for Godot, because when he comes, maybe tonight he'll come, we'll sleep in his barn, warm in the hay, everything will be good. But Godot never comes. Always there is that message that says, actually not today, but maybe tomorrow. It's rather like going into the bank and looking for the loan and being told, if you come back next week, we might be able to do something for you, but I'm not sure right now. Life is full of waiting. And what Beckett wanted to do, what Beckett strove to do, was to purify that down. What do you do? Because there is another question that is asked within the play. What do we do while waiting? And that's the key to life. We spend our lives filling the time by working, by loving, by marrying, by procreating, by exercise, by word games, games of imagination. We fill our time while waiting. Suddenly into our life, something completely different comes along, and it is fascinating for that moment. Pozzo arrives with Lucky on the end of a rope. What does that represent? It represents the fact that Pozzo is the boss and Lucky is the servant. That Lucky depends upon his position to give himself identity, and that Pozzo exploits that. Whether Pozzo is a real country gentleman with a manor house and that he's going to go to the fair to sell Lucky is actually irrelevant. I personally don't think he is. I think that Pozzo and Lucky are just as much lost as the two tramps are. And by the way, we call them tramps. There's nowhere in the things that are defined as tramps. They just happen to be two men. But this whole thing is a constant examination of the situation we are in the actuality of the moment. It's not real. It's true. And what Beckett is striving within this strange, weird, peculiar world is simply to demonstrate that life has a beginning, has an end, and in the middle, we wait. And the function of waiting is to fill each moment with some kind of activity to simply define that we exist. Now, the other play, Endgame. But by the way, I'm skating the surface here. I'm skating the surface. Read the plays, read the commentaries, work them out for yourselves. I'm just trying to, if you haven't read them, if you haven't thought about them, this is just to introduce you. I'm talking about the two plays that I have particular experience on. The other is Endgame, which is another enigma, or is it? I also played Ham in Endgame for the Beckett festival that we did, and traveled around with that into America and what have you. Again, this crazy, simple, peculiar, weird situation of a man not in a wheelchair, but in a chair that's got wheels on it, of another man, a man who is blind and cannot stand up, served by another man who can see but cannot sit down. Why not? In a room that has one door 2 windows, and 2 trash cans. Beckett does like making it simple and does like being enigmatic. Each window has a curtain. The trash cans each contain a parent, the parents of the man in the wheelchair. The door leads to what we are told is a kitchen. And the play is called Endgame, which for those of you who play chess will understand the term. It is the final part of the game, the part of the game where all things come to a conclusion. But do they? Because if Waiting for Godot is a play about the process of waiting, Endgame is a play about the process of ending, not the end, but the process of ending. It's about time, and it's about time condensed or expanded. It's about life and the concluding of it, not the conclusion, but the concluding. It is about process. What do we do while waiting, while ending? And time is an absurdity as well. I give you an example of what I mean. Again, it's one of the acting lessons I did. If you ever watch small children playing, time is meaningless in a child's mind. And there is only the actuality of the moment of playing. A child can jump from one game or playing to the next, regardless of content or purpose. It has a logic. The moment has a logic of its own. Now I'm a king, and now you're a prince. No, I'm now a pirate. And the children will jump. Their imaginations will leap from one to the other without a second thought. Time has no meaning, no logic in such a situation. The only time is now, and the only purpose is what. So, Endgame is filled with this. Clove, the guy who can't sit down, and his name is pronounced Clove, not Clove. Beckett was very insistent that it was pronounced in the same way as the small town at the mouth of Cork Harbour, which was a seaport called Cove. So Clove, his opening lines, and we're talking about a thing that is ending, finished. It's finished. Nearly finished. It must be nearly finished. Grain upon grain, one by one, and one day, suddenly, there's a heap. A little heap. The impossible heap. That comes from a Greek philosopher I can't remember the name of, and neither could Beckett, because Beckett describes him as some old Greek. The impossible heap is the concept of how many grains of millet does it take to make a heap? And the answer is impossible. You cannot say how many make a heap. At what point does one more grain of millet make it a heap? Are 3 grains a heap? Are 4? Are 24? Are 50? How many? At what point does it become a heap? How long is a life? At what point is a life complete? At what point is a life over? Thomas Hardy, in his book Tess of the D'Urbervilles, has this particular conundrum. There's a chapter in it when Tess has the baby, Sorrow the Undesired, she calls it. And I think the baby lives just for a month. But Hardy goes on to say within that month, that child had a full life. It experienced love, fear, hunger, plenty, warmth, climate, everything that you could experience in human existence at its most basic level, that child experienced. So how can you say it didn't have a full life? It experienced pretty much everything. And don't say, well, it didn't have sex. There's an awful lot of people go through life without experiencing sex. But what we're examining here through Beckett's purity of imagination and purity of language and simplicity of language. We're examining at what point is a life complete? At what point does the ending become the end? It is a game. It is a game. Life is a game. If Clove's first line is finished, it's finished. Ham's first line, when he takes off the handkerchief from the top of his head, me to play, old endgame. As if this is what always happens, he is yet again replaying the process of ending. And they will go through a whole sequence of activities in one single sweep. There is no intermission. One single sweep of activity until at the very end, Ham repeats that and puts the handkerchief back over his head again. And that cycle of ending is complete, but we have not ended. Clove has dressed, put on his hat, got his umbrella, got his bag, as if he's going to leave, but he does not leave. Ham is back into his original condition. We suspect that the two parents in the trash cans, which is a whole different issue I'm not going to go into now, that they may have ended, but we do not know. They may simply be withdrawing to come back again. The idea of the end is a very complex one. You might look at it scientifically. At what point does death occur? We used to think that death occurred when the heart stopped or when the breathing stopped. Then we discovered brain death. But then we discovered that if people were immersed in very cold water, you could bring them back from brain death and they would be absolutely fine. At what point is the end? And there is a wonderful moment in the play. I'm going to find the moment in the script because I haven't played the part for years and I can't remember it. This is Ham talking about trying to end. How could he achieve his end? And he's trapped in this chair. Perhaps I could throw myself out on the floor, dig my nails into the cracks, and drag myself forward with my fingers. It will be the end, and there I'll be. It will be the end. It, that moment of the end. And there I'll be, alone in the old refuge, alone against the silence and the stillness. Now, those two words are terribly important because silence implies nothing happening. But more important, the stillness. Now, everything that we know that is alive, be it sentient or not, if it is a living organism, moves. But even things that are inanimate have motion because every atom moves. Every molecule moves. Get it down to quantum level. Everything moves. What is the moment of stillness? Does it exist? Can it exist? Can one have perfect stillness? Is there ever an end? What is the end of us? At what point do we stop? When we give up? No, because we can start again. So I think what Beckett is looking at in this is that, and with Godot, two tremendous fundamental questions about the human condition, about how humanity works, how we work as people. And as I say, all of this is my opinion, but I did do the plays for a long time. It's you could almost bring it down. I'm going to bring in another quote. You could bring in Kant. Immanuel Kant had this famous, not so much a conundrum but this question about what is the essence of a thing in itself? Is a thing what we think it is, or is it only what we think it is because we are thinking it? It's a bit like Schrodinger's cat, dead or alive cat. If a thing is not seen, if a thing is not judged, if a thing has no opinion about it, is it the thing that it is. What is the essence of a thing? What is the essence of a thing? What is the essence of a man? What is the essence of humanity? King Lear, thou art the thing itself. Unaccommodated man is no more but such a poor, bare, forked animal as thou art. Even Shakespeare got it 400 years before Beckett. I've been privileged in a way, in that I have played two of Beckett's greatest characters. And I've also played one of Shakespeare's greatest characters, King Lear. I'm going to read you something I wrote a long time ago. My first true experience of Endgame was through Jan Kott's essay on King Lear. Jan Kott, by the way, wrote one of the best books on interpretation of Shakespeare for the 20th century, Shakespeare, Our Contemporary. I heartily recommend it. It will be on the reading list that we're going to post on the website after all this is over. Jan Kott's essay on King Lear. I was always aware of it as the classic Beckettian treatise on the concept of ending in the way that Waiting for Godot is the ultimate dramatic expression of waiting. Endgame embodies within it that desire in all of us to achieve a kind of perfection, even though the discovery of meaning is beyond us, to find purpose and completion in the time allotted, to come to terms with both the tragic and the absurd that was in us, and in completion we can hope to take nothing with us but satisfaction. In other words, we all try for the impossible. We all want a perfect life. We all want everything to be good and right and pure and to fulfill our own expectations. Now, I'd seen Endgame several times before playing it, and I always felt it had been treated too much as a tragedy. So, and it's not. He describes it, just as he describes Waiting for Godot as a tragicomedy, Endgame is a comedy. And so being able to perform Ham in a production where the absurdity and humor were developed properly has been always deeply satisfying. Again, as we were directed in Godot by Walter Asmus, the Beckett's close associate and assistant, we were directed in Endgame by Antoni Libera, who was Beckett always described as his Eastern Bloc spy. Antoni was Polish, and before the fall of the Berlin Wall and Glasnost and all of that, he worked away in Poland, translating Beckett and doing production of him in Russian and Polish. So Antoni, again, understood that same concept, that it was, in its own way, a perfect comedy. The absurdity of the behavior that we carry out in the process of bringing it all to a conclusion. The silly games we play. Above all, I again wrote before, Beckett was of the theatre, and his ideas can only be truly expressed through the rubrics of theatre, which always demand a balance maintained between the tragically absurd and the absurdly tragic. Because Endgame maintains this perfect balance, it may be, next to King Lear, the greatest play ever written. I think this play is possibly the purest piece of theatre ever composed. People will always describe Godot as Beckett's greatest achievement. To me, Endgame is more so in that it is the perfect expression of human frailty, of human weakness, of subservience, of oppression, of the futility of power, of the futility of service. Ham is in himself King Lear, a man with all the authority and none of the responsibility. Clove is in many ways not the fool, but the mad Tom of Lear. But in that play, all of our weakness in life and weakness in the process of ending, not ending our own lives, but letting life end, all of that futility is demonstrated quite magnificently. The influence that Beckett had in his writing was phenomenal. Harold Pinter, who, after Beckett, probably the most significant and great, one can't say these things, they're pejorative, but the greatest English playwright, or playwright in the English language, in the latter half of the 20th century. Harold Pinter was deeply affected by Beckett. And when he first read Beckett's poetry, long before Waiting for Godot came out, Pinter wrote a short essay on the fact that this man's writing is going to change the way we write in the 20th century. He predicted it, and as the plays began to materialize, Pinter became more and more and more influenced by that purity of purpose. Don't explain, merely tell. And if you look at plays like The Homecoming, which, again, to my mind, Pinter's greatest piece of writing, The Homecoming does not try to explain itself, not at any point. It is merely the behaviorism of a group of people in a certain place at a certain time in a certain circumstance. Pinter examines human frailty, human weakness in exactly the way that, well, not exactly the way that Beckett did, but as a derivative of the way that Beckett did. But the same is true. There was other writers who have done exactly the same. If you examine plays, Edward Albee would not be Edward Albee but for Samuel Beckett. And if you look at, for instance, A Delicate Balance, there is no excuse for a delicate balance. It is merely a group of people in a certain time, in a certain place, in a certain house, on a certain night, when certain things happen. And it is the occasion of the events of the relationships, the events of circumstance, totally devoid of time and space. What happens in that room on that night between those people is all that it is about. There's a purity about it. Tom Stoppard, deeply indebted. David Mamet, deeply indebted, but also Arnold Wesker and John Osborne, some of the angry young men that I talked about, influenced by Shaw, were also profoundly influenced by Beckett. To my personal sorrow, he became ill in 1988, just before he was meant to travel to Dublin to direct Waiting for Godot. And he died December 22nd, the following year, 1989. He was born on Good Friday. He died just before Christmas. And I have no doubt in my mind that both of those things would have amused him intensely. People always say he's very somber, and he always presented a somber image, but he was a man with phenomenal wit and a capacity for fun based on the unexpected reaction to any given moment. I think of all the people in the world that I regret not having been directed by, he's the one. So there you are. There's so much more that I could talk about with Beckett, but it's too complex to do in one simple, sorry, I just dropped my note. It's too complex to do in one short belt. I'm going to recommend some books to read. I'm not going to do it now. They'll be on the website. There's a wonderful biography called Damned to Fame, which is well worth reading. I have biographies to recommend for the other writers as well. But within this particular play, within Endgame, there are 2 or 3 quotes. You know, people are always asking about Beckett quotes in the way they ask me about Oscar Wilde quotes. There are certain fundamentals. And when you're examining a Beckett play, this one is a great one to look at, because the quote is, "The end is in the beginning, and yet we go on." It is a perfect quote because it is a perfect expression of the reality of life. Another one of Ham's quotes, which I think sums up all the frustration of life that we all go through. "You're on Earth. There's no cure for that." And the final one, which is the most true statement, I think possibly the most true statement about theater, about life, about poetry, about art, about everything. "Nothing is funnier than unhappiness." It's that principle, the tragicomic principle, that what makes us laugh is other people's misfortune. Beckett really knew it all and summed it all up. So anyway, yes, so a couple of questions coming in. How did theatre work as worship for the Greeks? It didn't, but it was out of worship. It was out of the process of worship, that the notion of the gods being approachable. What I loved about the Greek gods, and still do, is that they were so human. And the whole notion of, you've probably seen the meme on Facebook of, what caused most trouble in ancient history. Zeus couldn't keep it in his pants. The Greek gods were jealous, pathetic, petty, subject to flights of fancy and extreme anger. They were really human. So when the Greeks worshipped, they worshipped by the poets would write, the priests would praise, and out of that format grew what we understand as theatre. The idea that if you're going to worship the gods, why not tell stories about the gods? I don't know the exact answer. I don't think anybody absolutely knows the exact answer, but one grew from the other. So they didn't worship in theatres, but theatres grew out of the act of worship. What are the top 3 or so elements of the human condition that I used? That's really that's a really complex question, and I can't answer it in any simple sense. When I talked about Waiting for Godot, a play in which everything happens, all human life is there, but you could say that all human life is summed up in far too simple a term. Perception and deception, trying to understand, trying to deceive, self-aggrandizement, which is part so. Beckett wrote an additional line for Pozzo. When the play was first published, which is still the version that you get. If you go to the store and buy a copy of Waiting for Godot, you'll get it as it was originally published. But 25 years afterwards, in 1975, he did a production at the Schiller Theater in Germany, which is where he started to work with Walter Asmus. And 1975, yeah. And he did some editing of the play. So it's known as the Schiller version. And that's the version that we did at the Gate and toured the world with. Pozzo, this great confusion. Pozzo talks about the manor house. And he's always usually dressed up, in tweeds and things, and with a proper horsewhip and everything. We didn't do that. I put forward the proposition to Walter, who completely agreed and said Beckett would too, that Pozzo is just as impoverished or not as anybody else. He too is on a journey to where he does not know, but it leads him to his blindness. But he has a line when he's leaving in the first act, because he keeps losing things. And he's lost his watch, my half hunter. And he has the line, my grandpa gave it me, implying position and rank and inheritance. Then when he realizes that they're mocking him slightly, he says, I must have left it at the manor. Beckett added a phrase, and I loved it because it simply said, Pozzo is lying through his teeth, so that the line became, I must have left it at the manor, on the Steinway. And you know that this is bullshit. You just know that this man is phony. Self-aggrandizement. It is all those weaknesses that we suffer from that we try to conquer. Well, Gogo doesn't. Gogo just accepts it. Gogo accepts the inevitable. Didi, Vladimir is trying constantly to move it forward. Let's try this. Let's try that. Let's try this. Let's try that. Pozzo will always deceive. He wants to be thought greater than he is, because his only way of surviving life, you're on the earth. There's no cure for that. But his only way of surviving is by creating a sense of superiority for himself, being listened to, being admired, being respected. Lucky's only purpose in life is to serve, because by serving he has justification. So the answer to the question is there are no top three, it's everything. Do you think that the relationship of Pozzo and Lucky can be compared to the historical relationship of England and Ireland, respectively? That's a really yes and no. When we played New York first time at the Lincoln Center, one of the critics said that the way we were presenting it looked, because I was playing Pozzo with a very upper crust, not English accent, but Anglo-Irish accent. And so some of the critics jumped on it and said, oh, well, that's all about England and Ireland and England's suppression of Ireland. Well, I don't think it was. I don't think so. I think Beckett would not write something so blatantly and specifically political. I think it is much more to do with the human condition of superiority and the need to be served and the need to serve. How one gains, how one gets one's own, how you justify your own existence. And the important point about Lucky is that although he is the servant and although he serves, he is also the one with the ultimate wisdom. He is the only one who can actually explain it all and express it. He does it in the most complex way. Lucky's speech is so complex and so roundabout and so confusing, but it has the essence of wisdom in it. And it's a wisdom that Vladimir learns. He learns it from Pozzo, he learns it from Lucky. Where he's down in the grave, you know, the grave digger puts on the forceps. It's like you were plucked from the womb into the grave. It's suddenly Vladimir gets it. He sees the futility of it all, but he won't stop waiting because there is always the hope that something will turn up. If you like, Mr. Micawber in David Copperfield is one of those two tramps. He is always waiting for something to turn up. But I don't think that your question concerning the direct political relationship, I'm not sure that that is absolutely valid. Billy is one of the main characters in Endgame. No, it is Ham and Clove and Nag and Nell. So whatever you were playing wasn't one of those. Yes, the two in the trash cans, the parents. I think there is a wonderful symbol there about what do you do with the parents when you don't want to deal with them anymore. Well, nowadays we send them off to retirement homes if we can afford to. Ham puts them in trash cans, and they've lost their legs anyway on a cycling accident on Lake Como. But it is simply that you put them out with the trash, that they've had enough, that you've had enough of them. So there is that. Ham is one of the cruelest characters you'll ever come across. I mean, he's savagely cruel and totally pathetic, a bit like King Lear. Any other questions there? The Beckett Bridge in Dublin. Yes, they did. They opened the bridge, and we were there. The four of us from Waiting for Godot, we had become by that stage, I was going to say, well, famous. We'd become notorious for it. And so we were there for the opening of the Beckett Bridge. And we were also, if you ever go across the sea to Ireland, and you go to Dublin, and you go to the Shelburne Hotel, which is the premier hotel on St. Stephen's Green, and you walk through the lobby, you will find 4 paintings of Barry McGovern, Johnny Murphy as Dee Dee and Gogo, and of Stephen Brennan and Alan Stanford as Lucky and Pozzo. They were especially commissioned by one of Ireland's leading portrait painters. Not so much for us, but Waiting for Godot has become, I think, one of the great quintessential plays that came from Dublin. Okay, we're running out of time, and I want to tell you 2 or 3 things. First of all, there is a trivia question. The trivia question is concerning Waiting for Godot. You may have noticed that I mentioned that its first production was in Paris. And the guy who played my role although you could say I played his. The guy who played Pozzo was also the director. What was his name? That's your trivia question. The name of the man who was not only the original Pozzo, but also directed that original production of Not Waiting for Godot, but En attendant Godot in Paris. So what was his name? That's your trivia question. And first one, not the first one, but the one we pick out of the hat today will get tickets for our next production, whenever that will be. On that topic, we've now come to the end of this particular cycle of talks, but it's not over because we have made an executive decision that we are going to continue because you've been wonderful, and we get wonderful emails in and things. So what we're going to do is we're going to continue this into the foreseeable future. We're now going to do 3 webinars over the next 3 weeks on Oscar Wilde. That'll be me. I'm lining up other people to do webinars as well so that you don't just get sick of listening to me all the time. But we'll be starting a cycle of 3 plays about Oscar Wilde next Friday. So we're going to keep it same time every Friday at 2 o'clock until such time as nobody wants it then. But it does seem to suit a huge number of people. So Friday at 2 o'clock, next week, we begin our cycle of 3 Oscar Wilde programs. Yet again, let me remind you all how wonderful you are, how wonderful you've been, and that it is so important that you do help us in any way you can, whatever you can donate. Please go to the website, check on anything we send to you. If you see the big red button or if you see the donate here, please, 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 no matter how small, it all matters. We still have bills to pay. We still have to pay people's, we've still got to do pay packets. We've got to pay rents. And we are planning. We are budgeting and planning for next season already. One thing I do promise, whatever happens next season, there will be a Shakespeare. There will be an Irish play. And we'll be back with you on stage as soon as they allow us to do that. But in the meantime, we'll be here every Friday at 2 o'clock. And we'll have some specials coming up. I'm going to do a special for Bloomsday for James Joyce's Ulysses, which will be in June. And we're going to do some poetry and various other things as we start moving further into May. But in the meantime, thank you all for being with us. Go for the trivia question. You never know. You might know the answer. And in the meantime, and until we see you again next week, stay safe, wash your hands, don't breathe on people unless they're very, very intimate with you. And for that, goodbye.